His phone wouldn't stop vibrating in his back pocket, like it was trying to crawl out of his jeans. Caleb had one knee in the straw, one boot planted on a cracked concrete slab, and his flashlight clenched in his teeth. The air under the barn was sour and warm, the kind of smell that stayed in your hair. Somewhere above him, a board creaked as the wind pushed against the old siding. He tasted dust and metal and fear. When he finally yanked the phone out, the screen lit up his wrist and the underside of his jaw. 3 missed calls. 1 voicemail. The contact name made his stomach tighten. First County Bank. Caleb's hand shook just enough that the flashlight beam skittered across the ground. It landed on the thing that had pulled him down here in the first place. A pipe. Not an old rusted line he'd expect in a barn this age. This was newer PVC, clean and pale, running straight under a crossbeam and disappearing into the dirt like it had purpose. Like someone had planned it. Caleb swallowed, pulled the flashlight from his mouth, and followed the pipe with the beam until it ended at a flat, metal plate half buried beneath packed soil. 4 bolts. A seam around the edge. A hatch. His throat tightened. He pictured all the ways this could go wrong. Insurance. Inspectors. More money he didn't have. Another mess he couldn't fix with duct tape and prayers. Then his phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen and saw a text preview from his sister, Emma. "Did you ever find Dad's envelope?" The one he said was, "For when it gets bad." Caleb stared at the words until they blurred. He wiped his face with the back of his wrist and felt wetness there. He didn't remember crying. He didn't remember deciding to. His flashlight beam fell back onto the hatch. Right at the seam. Caleb set his jaw, slid the flat end of a rusted pry bar under the edge, and pulled. The metal gave with a low, stubborn groan, like it was mad about being disturbed. Cold air rushed up, and with it, a faint electronic hum. Then, from the dark below, a small green light blinked. Caleb froze. And right beside that blinking light, taped to the inside of the hatch, was an envelope in his dad's handwriting. The farm sat outside Clear Lake, Iowa, tucked between a 2-lane road and miles of flat fields that looked pretty from a distance and punishing up close. People drove past and said things like, "God, I love the Midwest," like it was a mood board. They didn't see the broken fence posts, the soft spots in the roof, the way the gravel driveway turned to mud every time it rained hard. They didn't see Caleb's hands in January, red and split from working with gloves that were already too thin. Caleb was 36 and felt older in the ways that mattered. His dad, Tom, had died 2 years ago, fast and quiet in a hospital room that smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee. After the funeral, people had brought casseroles and said, "He'd be proud of you," and Caleb had nodded because it was easier than saying he didn't know if that was true. He didn't know what his dad would be proud of anymore. Surviving didn't feel like an accomplishment. It felt like something you did because there wasn't an off switch. On Caleb's kitchen counter, the mail stacked up in a leaning tower of envelopes and windowed notices. Electric. Feed supplier. Property taxes. The bank. The bank again. The kind of paper that made your chest feel tight before you even opened it. He'd started leaving it there, unopened, like if he didn't look, it couldn't be real. Like the farm couldn't be slipping away if he didn't read the words that said it was. That morning he'd poured coffee into a travel mug that used to belong to his ex-wife, Lauren. The mug still had a faded sticker from some 5K they'd done back when they were the kind of couple that signed up for things together. Lauren had left 3 years ago, right before Tom got sick. She didn't slam doors. She didn't scream. She'd sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around her own mug, and said, "I can't keep living in a place where everything is always one bad week away from falling apart." Caleb had wanted to argue. He'd wanted to tell her he was trying. Instead, he'd watched her eyes. They looked tired, not mean. That was the worst part. It would have been easier if she'd been cruel. He could have hated her. But she wasn't. She was just done. Now, the house held sound differently. The refrigerator hum seemed louder. The floor creaked like it was bored. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like waiting. Caleb had driven into town for parts because the water line near the barn kept freezing. The heater in his old pickup worked when it felt like it, so he'd kept one hand on the wheel and the other wrapped around the travel mug, trying to steal warmth. He stopped at the Starbucks in the grocery store because the idea of a coffee he didn't make himself felt like a luxury and an insult at the same time. The cup was already getting cold by the time he pulled back onto the road, the lid clicking every time he hit a pothole. At a stoplight, his phone lit up with the bank's number. He let it ring. He told himself he'd call back when he had a plan. He told himself that a lot. By the time he got home, the wind had picked up. It pushed loose straw across the yard like it was trying to clean up for him, like it had some shame on his behalf. Caleb carried the parts into the barn and got to work because work was the only thing that made the day feel shaped. The barn was the same barn his dad had worked in, the same beams, the same nails hammered in by hands that weren't there anymore. Caleb hated how much he still expected to hear his dad's voice, a cough, a mutter, the sound of boots on wood. Sometimes he'd catch himself turning his head like someone had called his name. He'd been kneeling near the back wall, elbow deep in the mess of old lines and fittings, when his pry bar hit something that didn't sound like dirt or rock. It sounded hollow. He'd scraped away a layer of packed soil and found the edge of a board that didn't match the others. Too straight. Too intentional. He told himself it was probably nothing. Some old repair. Some leftover from decades ago. He told himself that because nothing was the only kind of surprise he could afford. But when he pulled the board free, there it was. A length of PVC pipe, pale and smooth, running under the barn like a secret. He stared at it like it might start moving. He touched it with his fingertips and felt how clean it was compared to everything else down there. His heart thumped hard enough that he got annoyed at himself. He was not the kind of guy who spooked easily. He'd dealt with storms, busted equipment, livestock getting sick in the middle of the night. But this felt different. This felt like finding a locked door in your own house. He crawled along the pipe, pushing aside straw, sliding his shoulders under a beam that pinched his jacket. The farther he went, the colder the air got. His breath started showing, even though it wasn't that cold outside. That didn't make sense, and Caleb didn't like things that didn't make sense. Halfway down, his phone buzzed again. The vibration sounded louder under the barn, sharp and impatient. He ignored it. He kept moving because turning back would mean admitting he was afraid, and he was too tired to have that conversation with himself. The pipe ended at a patch of ground that looked disturbed, just slightly smoother than the rest. Caleb brushed it with his gloved hand and felt metal under the dirt. He scraped more away until he saw the outline of a plate. Bolts. A seam. He sat back on his heels and stared at it. His mouth was dry. His brain did that thing it did when money was involved, when danger was possible. It jumped to the worst case first. Environmental hazard. Illegal dumping. Something that would get him fined into the ground. Something his dad had known about and kept from him. Something that proved the farm wasn't just failing, but cursed. Above him, the barn groaned in the wind, and Caleb suddenly missed his dad so hard it felt like a physical ache. Not the dad who gave advice and fixed things, but the dad who stood in this barn and knew what belonged here and what didn't. The dad who would have looked at a pipe and said, "Well, that's not right," and then somehow made it right. Caleb pulled out his phone and saw the missed calls again. The voicemail notification. The text from Emma. He stared at Emma's message like it was a dare. "Did you ever find Dad's envelope?" Caleb leaned forward, pressed his palm on the metal plate, and felt the cold go straight into his skin through the glove. He imagined his dad, 2 years ago, knowing he was sick, knowing Caleb would be stubborn, knowing Caleb would avoid asking for help until he had nothing left to hold on to. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Caleb whispered, even though no one could answer. His voice sounded small under the barn. He slid the pry bar into the seam and took a breath he didn't feel ready for. His arms were already tired. His mind was louder than the wind. He pictured the bank officer's face, polite and final. He pictured the for sale sign. He pictured this barn empty, the land worked by someone else who didn't know his dad's name. Then he pulled. The plate resisted, then shifted with a low groan that traveled up the pipe like a warning. Cold air rose from below, cleaner than the barn air, and with it came a steady hum, like a machine that never slept. Caleb froze as a small green light blinked in the dark. He aimed the flashlight down and saw, taped to the underside of the hatch, a plain envelope. His dad's handwriting was so familiar it made Caleb's chest tighten. And for a second, the whole farm felt like it was holding its breath with him. Caleb didn't open the envelope right away. He climbed out from under the barn with stiff knees and dirt smeared across his jacket. The sky had gone that pale gray blue that meant afternoon was slipping toward evening, and the wind carried the smell of snow even though the forecast said rain. He shut the barn door slower than usual, like slamming it might make something irreversible happen. Inside the house, he washed his hands at the sink until the water ran cold. The envelope sat on the counter, next to the stack of mail he'd been avoiding. It looked ordinary. Just paper. No magic to it. That almost made it worse. If this was important, if this was something that could have helped him sooner, then it had been sitting under his feet the whole time. He finally opened it with a dull kitchen knife. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. No legal language. No long explanation. Just his dad's handwriting, careful and uneven, like he'd taken his time. Caleb, if you're reading this, it means things probably didn't go how I hoped. I'm sorry I didn't say this out loud. I thought I'd have more time, and then I didn't. Under the note was a small plastic card, the kind you'd expect from a storage unit or a prepaid service. It had a handwritten label taped to it. Clear Lake Data Co-op. Caleb frowned. He read the note again, slower this time. There's a server room under the barn. It sounds crazy. I know. It started as a favor for a friend and turned into something steady. It's not illegal. Everything's permitted. The paperwork is in the blue folder in the desk. I kept it quiet because I didn't want it to change how you see this place. The hum you hear means it's still running. That means it's still paying. Caleb sat down hard in the chair by the table. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, and the sound echoed in the empty kitchen. A server room. Under his barn. He laughed once, short and breathless, then stopped because it came out wrong. His dad had been old school to the bone. Still used a flip phone. Still balanced his checkbook by hand. The idea of him running anything with the word data in it felt like a joke. But then Caleb thought about the pipe. The clean installation. The cold air. The steady hum. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Emma calling. Hey, she said when he answered, her voice tight with worry. I've been calling all day. Are you okay? I think so, Caleb said, and realized he meant it in a way he hadn't in a long time. I found something. There was a pause. What kind of something? He told her. About the pipe. The hatch. The envelope. He left out how scared he'd been, how close he'd felt to breaking under the barn. He didn't want to give that fear more weight than it already had. Emma didn't interrupt. When he finished, she let out a slow breath. Dad always said the land could do more than one job, she said quietly. I thought he meant crop rotation or something. So did I. They stayed on the phone while Caleb went back out to the barn, flashlight in hand. This time, when he opened the hatch, he did it with intention instead of dread. The metal door swung up and rested against the dirt wall. Cold air spilled out, fogging his breath. A narrow ladder led down into a clean, insulated space that didn't belong under a century-old barn. Racks of equipment lined the walls, lights blinking in calm, orderly patterns. Thick cables ran along the ceiling. The hum was steady and reassuring, like a heartbeat. It's real, Caleb said, more to himself than to Emma. It's actually real. Of course it is, she said. Dad wouldn't have to do something like that. There was a laminated sign on the wall with a phone number for maintenance. Another with emergency shutdown instructions. Everything labeled. Everything thought through. It made Caleb's chest ache in a different way. His dad had been planning for a future he knew he might not be in. On a small desk in the corner sat a blue folder. Caleb opened it with hands that were steadier than he expected. Inside were permits from the county, utility agreements, a simple contract. The Clear Lake Data Co-op rented space for servers that supported small local businesses, farms, and clinics that couldn't afford big city infrastructure. Low overhead. Long-term agreements. Monthly payments wired automatically. Caleb flipped to the most recent statement and felt his breath catch. It wasn't life-changing money. It wasn't some miracle fix. But it was enough. Enough to cover the electric bill. Enough to keep the bank from breathing down his neck. Enough to buy time. I didn't know him like this, Caleb said softly. Emma didn't rush to fill the silence. He didn't want you to feel like the farm wasn't enough, she said. He was proud of you, Cal. He just worried. Caleb swallowed. He thought about all the nights he'd lain awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice he'd made. He thought about how stubborn he'd been, how alone he'd felt even when people were trying to help. The server lights blinked on, indifferent to his feelings, steady in their work. They didn't care if he believed in them or not. They just kept going. After he hung up with Emma, Caleb climbed back up and closed the hatch, careful this time. He brushed dirt from his jeans and stood in the barn, listening. The hum was still there, faint but present, like a secret he finally understood. That evening, he did something small but unfamiliar. He called the bank back. The officer sounded surprised to hear from him. Caleb didn't oversell anything. He didn't promise what he couldn't deliver. He just explained that he had a supplemental income stream, that he needed a little flexibility, that he was willing to work with them. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the officer said, "Send over the documentation, and we'll see what we can do." It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no. When the call ended, Caleb sat on the front steps and watched the light fade from the fields. His coffee mug was still in the truck, probably cold by now. He didn't go get it. Instead, he stayed where he was, feeling the weight in his chest shift just a little. He knew better than to think this fixed everything. The roof still needed work. The loneliness didn't disappear just because money eased up. Lauren wasn't coming back. His dad was still gone. But for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel like the ground was giving way under him. It felt solid enough to stand on. Caleb didn't sleep much that night. He lay on his back, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling that looked like a river on a map. The house made its usual noises. Pipes ticking. Wind brushing the siding. The hum from under the barn traveled through the ground, low and steady, like something alive but uninterested in him. Every time he closed his eyes, his brain started tallying again. How long the money might last. What would happen if equipment failed? What would happen if the co-op pulled out? What would happen if the bank decided it wasn't enough? Relief and fear sat side by side in his chest, neither willing to leave. Around 2 a.m, he gave up and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. He spread out the blue folder, the bank statements, the permits. He read everything slowly, the way his dad used to read instructions, lips moving just a little. It all checked out. No tricks. No hidden disasters waiting in fine print. That almost made it harder. If this was real, if this had been here the whole time, then it meant Caleb's worst moments weren't caused by fate or bad luck. They were caused by isolation. By not knowing. By not asking. That realization pressed down on him harder than any overdue notice ever had. The next day brought gray skies and a light drizzle that turned the yard slick. Caleb spent the morning fixing a fence line, the repetitive motion calming in a way thinking never was. Around noon, his phone buzzed. A voicemail notification. This one wasn't new. He recognized the date. It was from his dad. Left a week before he died. Caleb had seen it before and ignored it every time. Some part of him had been afraid that if he listened, it would make the loss final in a way he wasn't ready for. Another part had been afraid his dad would say something he couldn't live up to. He leaned against a fence post, rain dotting his jacket, and pressed play. "Hey Cal," his dad's voice said, thinner than Caleb remembered but still steady. "If you're hearing this, I probably didn't get the chance to say it right. I know you think you have to carry this place alone. You don't. I made some choices so you wouldn't have to drown just to keep the land. That doesn't mean you failed. It means I love you." The message ended with a soft click. Caleb stared out at the field until the fence blurred. He didn't cry right away. He felt hollow first, like something had been scooped out of him and left space behind. Then the tears came, quiet and embarrassing even though no one was there to see. He wiped his face and felt angry in a way he hadn't let himself feel before. Angry at his dad for not telling him sooner. Angry at himself for assuming help meant weakness. Angry at the years he'd spent thinking endurance was the same thing as strength. That afternoon, he drove into town for groceries and ended up sitting in the parking lot longer than necessary. He watched people load bags into trunks, kids arguing about snacks, a couple leaning into each other without thinking about it. Normal life. The kind he'd convinced himself he didn't get to have. Inside the store, he ran into Mrs. Alvarez from down the road. She'd lived there as long as he could remember, always waving from her porch, always asking how his dad was doing back when there was still an answer to that question. "How are you holding up, Mijo?" she asked, adjusting her mask out of habit even though no one wore them anymore. Caleb hesitated. The old answer rose up automatically. "Fine. Busy. Getting by." "I've been better," he said instead. She nodded like that was the only reasonable response. "Me too," she said. "That's how most of us are, I think." They stood there a moment, neither rushing away. It wasn't some big conversation. It didn't solve anything. But it felt like a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. The breaking point came later that evening, alone in the barn again. Caleb stood over the hatch, listening to the hum, and felt the weight of a choice settle in. He could keep treating this discovery like a secret lifeline, something to cling to quietly while still pretending he was fine. Or he could accept what it really was. Proof that his dad had adapted. That survival didn't mean staying exactly the same. Caleb realized that what scared him most wasn't losing the farm. It was changing it. Letting it become something his dad hadn't grown up with, even if his dad had already taken that step. He sat on a hay bale and let the thought sit there, uncomfortable and true. If he wanted the farm to last, he couldn't keep living like it was a museum to his past. He couldn't keep pushing people away because pride told him he should handle everything himself. That night, he texted Emma first, then a local accountant his dad had mentioned once, then a contractor about the roof. Each message felt like admitting something he'd avoided saying out loud. "I need help." It didn't feel good. But it felt honest. Caleb turned off the barn lights and walked back to the house under a sky that hadn't cleared but didn't feel as heavy anymore. The hum followed him through the ground, steady and patient. For the first time, he understood that the hardest part wasn't finding the hatch or opening it. It was deciding what to do once you knew it was there. Caleb started small, because that was all he trusted. The next morning, he made a list on the back of an old receipt. Not a grand plan. Not a 5-year vision. Just the things that needed attention before they became emergencies. Call the roofer again. Email the data co-op contact. Ask the accountant about quarterly estimates. Fix the leak under the kitchen sink that had been dripping so long he'd started to tune it out. He taped the receipt to the fridge with a chipped magnet shaped like Iowa. Then he made breakfast. Actual breakfast. Eggs. Toast. He ate standing at the counter, phone face down, letting the quiet be quiet instead of tense. It felt strange to move through the morning without that constant buzz of panic under everything. Not gone. Just quieter. The bank emailed back by noon. Not approval. Not rejection. A request for more documentation and a meeting next week. Caleb read it twice, waiting for the punchline that never came. He sat down at the kitchen table and let himself feel it. This was what progress looked like. Slow. Conditional. Real. That afternoon, he cleaned out his dad's desk. He'd avoided it for 2 years, opening drawers only when he absolutely had to, like the desk might crumble if disturbed. Inside were old receipts, seed catalogs, a half-working calculator, and a photo Caleb hadn't seen in years. It showed him at 10 or 11, grinning with a missing front tooth, standing next to his dad in the barn. Both of them covered in dust. Both of them looking tired and proud in that uncomplicated way kids assume adults always feel. Caleb sat there a long time with the photo in his hands. He realized something then that surprised him. The discovery under the barn hadn't just been about money or survival. It was proof that his dad had been changing quietly while Caleb was busy trying to freeze everything in place. Tom hadn't betrayed the past by adapting. He'd honored it by making sure the land could keep going. That night, Caleb called Lauren. He hadn't planned to. He didn't expect anything from it. He just found himself staring at her contact name and feeling less afraid than usual. She answered on the third ring. "Hey," she said, cautious but not cold. "Hey," he replied. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "I just wanted to say, I understand some things better now. About why you left. I don't think I did before." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. "I'm glad," she said finally. "I didn't want you to hurt like that." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not asking for anything. I just didn't want that to stay unsaid." When they hung up, he didn't feel lighter or heavier. Just settled. Like he'd put something down that he'd been carrying out of habit. Weeks passed. The roof got patched, not replaced, but patched well enough to last the winter. The accountant helped him set up a system that didn't make his head spin. The data co-op sent a technician who shook Caleb's hand, complimented the setup, and talked to him like he belonged in the conversation. The bank meeting ended with a revised payment plan and a warning to stay in touch. Caleb did. He started meeting Emma for coffee every other Saturday. He talked more with Mrs. Alvarez when he saw her. He didn't pretend things were perfect. He didn't pretend he had it all figured out. One evening, months later, Caleb stood in the barn again, listening to the hum beneath his feet. The space felt different now. Not haunted. Not heavy. Just used. He thought about how close he'd been to losing everything, not because he wasn't capable, but because he'd confused suffering with loyalty. He'd believed that if he struggled enough, it would somehow prove something. What it proved instead was that people break when they're alone too long. Caleb closed the hatch and brushed the dust from his hands. He turned off the lights and stepped outside as the sun dipped low, painting the fields in soft gold. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a miracle. But it was his. Later that night, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that stayed warm longer than expected. He thought about his dad, about the envelope, about the quiet ways love shows up when it knows it won't be there forever. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Emma, then erased it. Typed again. "I think Dad knew something I didn't. That taking help doesn't mean giving up." She replied a few minutes later. "He always did." Caleb leaned back in his chair and let that sit. Life hadn't turned into a story you'd brag about. The farm still demanded more than it gave some days. The future was still uncertain. But uncertainty no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like space. And sometimes he realized that was enough. If you've ever found yourself holding something together by sheer will, afraid that asking for help would make it all fall apart, maybe this lands with you too. Maybe the thing that saves you isn't buried under a barn, but closer than you think, waiting for you to notice it. And when you do, the real work isn't opening the hatch. It's choosing not to close yourself off again once you see what's inside.